Thanks. It is great to be talking to you all the way from Canada, even if you're very tiny on my screen. I can't see who's there, but I can see people. And yeah, before I start, partly in response to Shushi and Anne's talk the other day, and partly to share from the lands that I am on, and the slides I share with my students, I want to give what in Canada is called a land acknowledgement. The UBC campus at Point Grey is on the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Musqueam people. But the broader Vancouver area, which is where I'm talking to you from at the moment, is the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And you can see a photo there of the beautiful but heartbreaking reconciliation pole, which is just near my office and tells the story of the Indian residential school system in Canada. But part of my own land acknowledgement, I like to share not only the lands that I am currently on, but the lands that I have been on, that I have benefited from being on. And so I shared that I grew up on and call home the lands of the Kaurna people in the place that they call Tandanya. So I do teach in the Vantage One Science program. This is quite a unique program where students who've met all the academic requirements for direct entry, but not quite the language requirements, get into their first year program. They have their first year science program stretched over 3 terms instead of 2. Yes, they're called terms. It's a little bit weird. And then they get these 2 academic English courses on top of that. So the first one is LLED 200 and 201 in science. And this is really much focused on grammar and writing and different genres and stuff like that. And then VAT 140, which has the very empty name of Content and Language Enrichment Tutorials, is designed to support 3 of the science courses in term 1, chemistry, physics and maths, and 3 in term 2, science communication, which is a bit more focused on understanding what is research, the unknowables, how do you evaluate evidence in science, and then computer science and earth and ocean science. So my colleague Jennifer talked about her work in arts in particular recently in LED 200. I'm in science, and she's written this fantastic chapter that I do recommend. She describes it as having written it for herself when she first came to SFL, when she started at Vantage College. And she does a great job of summarizing how these 3 common responses, criticisms of writing can be fixed with SFL concepts. So nominalization, theme patterns, process types, and so on. And this is a good summary of what's mostly covered in LOD 200. There's some variation, but these are the hero concepts. This is, if you've got one class to teach students SFL, these are the concepts you go for to have maximum impact in writing. So I'm teaching the second course. And so what do I choose that's going to add value to their science courses in particular? And the other important influencing factor is my work with Jennifer. So I think in 2019, she came to me in summer and said, you know what, I've gotten really interested in circumstances. I read this article by Shushi and Isabel, and I think there's something to it. And I was just like, okay. And last year we had this paper published, Pomp and Circumstances, which you should read just because there are so many circumstance puns in every title. It's great. But that's really inspired me to incorporate circumstances a bit more in my teaching. So in 2020, my first 2 years here at Vantage College, I was teaching both courses. Then in 2020, I was put just on VAT 140. We were, of course, online. Our students were mostly in China, so the time difference was terrible. I had to go back to scratch and rewrite my course. So I talked to the instructors and looked at what other language needs students mostly had. And in term 1, they weren't actually doing much writing at all in their science courses. They mostly had to read these textbooks, which do vary, but some of them are very speech-like and like a teacher is talking to you, and deconstructing the complex grammar of that is a thing, as well as the increasing technicality of these first-year courses. In second term, now they start writing in science communication and earth and ocean science and doing research. And of course, paraphrasing, plagiarism and citation start to become an issue according to the instructors. And also in science communication, you've got this added challenge of moving from science is certain to how do we think the moon is, or like the moon was created? We don't know. And so these were the language needs that I identified. And so what I chose as my SFL sidekicks is that if in term 1, their needs were reading textbooks, deconstructing particularly the complex noun groups and also complex grammar, I call my focus a focus on technicality and precision. This is how I package it for the students. And I draw on register to kind of contextualize everything, really rough and ready transitivity, and then go deep into clauses, logical relationships, circumstances, and wrap it all together with logical grammatical metaphor at the end. And then in term 2, their needs were that paraphrasing and citation, and they start to move from this is how you use language to how do I want to use language strategically for different audiences and different purposes. So I present that as a focus on repositioning and then academic presentations. I won't talk about the presentations today because that's like 3 other presentations in itself. And the concepts I draw on is engagement from the appraisal system, of course, APA and referencing, and also some interpersonal grammatical metaphor. So what I want to show you is just some slides that I show with my students to show you how deep and wide and interesting it is. So this is the timeline. You can see it's quite a long program at Vantage College, about 10 months altogether. And so in term 1, in blue there, that's our focus mostly on the experiential and logical there. And you can see there are 2 group analysis projects in the first term, and then we wrap it up with grammar for science, which is my way of presenting grammatical metaphor. And I wrap it up with an interesting assessment, which is a grammar discussion where they're given 3 excerpts from textbooks chosen by the science instructors, and they analyze them for any of the features we've talked about, and then talk to me for 5 minutes to explain how that helps them understand science. In term 2, we have that focus on repositioning at the start. They do a repositioning assignment. So I've chosen to, instead of doing paraphrasing and citation by itself, because they've gotten a bit of that from their other instructors in term 1, I try to focus on the interpersonal element because I find our international students are actually quite thirsty for that. They know they're working on developing the technicality, but they're struggling. How do they present themselves in uncertainty? So adding that engagement and interpersonal grammatical metaphor has been really valuable, and hopefully research will show that it transfers to their assignments, although haven't had time to look at that data yet. And then we move on to academic presentations. So this is a slide that I taught last week, I think. You can see just a simple maths example has quite a complex verbal group there noun group there to break down. And helping them to be able to deconstruct this to figure out what is part of helping them to solve maths. You may notice that I've described the post-modifying prepositional phrase as a circumstance. We're following Dreyfus and Bennett's call for circumstantiation to embrace circumstances at different ranks, and I found it super useful, particularly avoiding that confusion students have between ranking circumstances and embedded post-modifiers, but also so much information in science and academic writing is included there. So they had that last week, this year's class, and I'm trying to get them to do grammatical intricacy to contextualize how all these features relate and build that grammatical intricacy and how changing that has impact on their language, the reading and the writing. I upgraded the materials this year, and I've just given them Halliday and Matheson's logical tables slightly adapted, but I should be clear, I'm not expecting them to do a totally perfect linguistic analysis and memorize it. I had a student in class yesterday who was like, well, we have this table for the exam. I'm like, there's no exam. I just want you to be able to identify extending logic, maybe the category, but most importantly, be able to read. One of the things that really confuses them is interrupting clauses. This is an example from the maths textbook that is relatively simple, but you can see I'm throwing a lot of information at them, and we just finished week 3 of term. So moving on to circumstances now, this is one of my favorite examples. It comes from the maths textbook. It's about a man who was murdered, and you've got to figure out how quickly his body cooled. And I think this is a really good example of if you don't pay attention to the circumstances, which are underlined, which give all the details about time and place, you can't figure out the maths you've got to solve. It doesn't make sense if you leave out the circumstances. So I think while it makes sense when we're focusing on teaching writing that we focus on participants and processes particularly the extended participants, if we leave out circumstances, there's a lot of detail and important detail potentially left out. This one is from chemistry, and I think is part of talking about the probability distribution of electrons in an atom, and it uses the metaphor of an apple tree dropping apples around the trunk in rings. Just take my word for that. So getting them to be able to read this first as participant, process, connector, process, participant is helpful for them to just be able to deconstruct the sentence. And calling those embedded circumstances helps by helping them realize that what it is modifying is actually the head noun, not the whole activity. So emphasizing that the summing is not, we are not sitting in a ring doing summing, but that each ring is around, is where the apples are, etc., etc. So I found the embedded circumstances really super productive to include. I have just limited it to embedded circumstances, but yeah, so much work there. Another point on the significance of circumstances is when we were online and I was teaching asynchronously and I had time, I went through all the readings for 1 week of class, physics, chemistry, calculus, the week I was teaching circumstances. And I found almost every category of circumstance, like almost every category. I had to look a little bit further for a few more. So this is hugely important. So what did students do with that? I want to show you some activities they did and their assessments. There will be a bit snapshotty on the screen, so if you want to come back and look at them a bit closely later, just ask. So one of the things that I really enjoy about what I'm doing is because I have students for 3 hours a week, I give them 1 hour a week to work in small groups in term 1, and they bring along a text from their science course that they didn't understand, that they need to revise, that they struggled with. So from this group from last year, you can see physics, and they're breaking down clause boundaries, embedded clauses. They think everything's an interrupting clause, and starting to get into that logic, identifying the different transitivity parts. Moving into chemistry now, but focusing primarily on the types of logic there. Back to, I think this is physics, and now talking about circumstances. So identifying all the circumstantial sort of elements, which is a good way to then move on to their position and their types. So for this one, you can see after a circumstance, they've got PP for prepositional phrase, E for embedded, R for ranking. And yeah, so for both of these units, they bring 3 texts for 3 weeks and analyze them for whatever they've learnt about. And then as the assignment, they write it up as a group analysis. So for this group, this is just an excerpt, but you can see breaking down this, going back to this text and analyzing a whole lot of detail. It's not perfect, but I got to say last year's students blew me away with how much they could analyze and how insightful they got about this sort of thing. I did ask them to write a little summary about it. And the point I quite like at the end of this is, you know, we're getting there. This would have been week 5 of term. To recapitulate, according to the number of grammatical intricacy indicating 3 clauses per sentence, we realize that this text is more speech-like instead of reaching academic style. And that's one thing I really want them to understand. We're teaching them how to write in LLED in an academic way, but then they're reading these really speech-like textbooks. And so understanding why helps them choose how they use language. So moving on to their circumstance group analysis, you can see they've analysed the form, the position, and the types and subtypes and using the questions. And I want to draw attention to a couple that have been highlighted, because one of the interesting things that came up in discussion is there were a lot of circumstances, which not a lot, but some where I, as a non-scientist linguist, would read them congruently, usually as location. But the students and my TA, who was a biologist, could turn around and say, actually, understanding physics, it's more of a manner, or it's more of a condition or whatever. So I'm not convinced by these particular ones, but the point is they're grappling with those meanings and how those meanings can change and have a common sense. And I'm thinking of it as scientific metaphorical. And you can see here that from their own calculations, about 60% of the circumstances they looked at were embedded. just within this first year textbook excerpt. So if we don't include those, that's a lot of circumstantial meaning that doesn't get paid attention to. And at the end there, I really like that summary sentence. Circumstances in each sentence support the text to be more accurate about the location, method, and condition of the atomic emission relating to the moving energy between atom and electron. Love it. Like I said, I have a grammar discussion at the end where I give them 3 texts selected by the science instructors. And this was all I asked them to do, was have something that they could put on the screen. But this student went above and beyond, so it's a good one to show you how far they went. So she decided to focus on chemistry and circumstances and did a little table and did a little summary of the analysis. And then I love these notes that she added, because I was like, you've got to explain it to me. I don't know chemistry. And so she's like, well, because Jodie doesn't know chemistry, I want to explain this to her. And she talks about the influence of different points. And at the end there, you can see this text is something between academic-like and spoken-like. And the reason is it should be comprehensible for freshman students. So having that realization that language is purposeful and yeah, what the textbooks are doing is really powerful. So moving on to the repositioning assignment, for this one, I gave them the opportunity, well, I asked them to collect 3 texts, a Wikipedia or encyclopedia entry, a general audience text, and an academic text like an article. And then for the repositioning assignment, they had to take a section and just change the position. With referencing and so on. So for this one, this student blew me away. So she's taken an excerpt from the Scientific American blog, which is a bit of an interview. This is just the first paragraph. She did more. She repositions it. And look, I'm flashing this up to you, but this is her description. I've put in bold all of the linguistic concepts she drew on to explain exactly what she did in rewriting that paragraph. I mean, it's great. So I've thrown a lot of stuff at my students this year. And like Cassie read out in my bio, I do tend to describe myself as somebody who uses SFL to teach the students, but then LCT to figure out what I'm doing and if it works or why. But I did teach recently a workshop. I dived back into semantic density for a workshop for graduate STEM students. That went really well, I've got to say. It was amazing. So going back to the translation device for epistemic semantic density, which focuses on how complexity is built in language. You may or may not be familiar with the wording tool with the focus on technical or everyday words. I think that's adequately covered in the existing LLED course. But if we move into word grouping, and if Jagen's in the room, he can explain how much SFL did influence the shaping of this. But embedded, categorized, and located are key ways of adding words together to build complexity through epistemic semantic density. And for any linguist, it's quite clear from the examples. Embedded, categorized, and located are embedded clauses, classifiers, and post-modifying prepositional phrases. So going back to this has made me go, that's why it works. That's why what I chose in term 1 actually worked in helping them grapple with the complexity of language, first deconstructing it to be able to get at the science for the textbook, but then later rework it in repositioning and grammatical metaphor for their own writing for purposeful language use. So what does this mean? Clauses, logic, circumstances, and engagement are hugely useful in EAP, scientific, pedagogic, and academic language. And students who are, remember, international, first-year students, English as an additional language students, science students can successfully learn enough of this grammatical complexity to apply it to their reading and writing and presenting in the end. Now, I do have to acknowledge that this is possible due to the unique circumstances I am in that are unlikely to be duplicated. We have 2 academic English courses for 2 terms, 3 contact hours per week per course, which means I could give students time in class to really develop their analytical capacity with texts that they brought in. I help them, my TA helps them. There's a lot of time to just do things wrong, and that's okay until you get an idea, a useful, productive vision of it. Our classes are capped. For VAT 140, it's maximum of 25. For LLED, it's 16, although my LLED class this year is 9 students, which is amazing. And SFL is institutionally supported within Vantage College, and I have opportunity to discuss this with science colleagues. Also, this was the only course I worked on for the last 2 years, which I've got to acknowledge is a privileged position to be in. And particularly when I was teaching online and asynchronously, as difficult as that was, that gave me a lot of time to really develop good materials and then review them in the past couple of years. However, I don't want that to be, Jodie, that's great, I can't do that. But I want you to think of this as a proof of concept. These concepts merit more attention in higher education linguistic research. We need more analysis of how it's used and why it's used that way, particularly in Canada. Here we're using so much Australian high school material, and it's like, come on, we need to do our own or get some more here. We need more attention in instruction and materials development, but I do want to acknowledge time is important as a grammatical circumstance, but also for instructor and student circumstances. The time I had to develop these materials, the time I give the students to be able to develop their capacity with them is quite an important factor there. And with that, if you have any questions, I'm happy to hear them. These are my references, my credits, and my contact details are on the screen. Thank you.